Picture this. You're crouched in a freezing stone corridor at 3 in the morning, your legs cramping from hours of waiting, rats scurrying over your feet, and the smell of human waste from the castle's garderobe making you gag. Your target finally appears, but instead of the clean, silent kill you've planned, your rusty blade gets stuck halfway through his ribs. He screams. Guards come running. You're now bleeding from 3 sword wounds, running barefoot through muddy streets, while an entire town hunts you like a rabid dog. Welcome to the glamorous life of a medieval assassin. Forget everything you think you know about medieval killers for hire. There were no shadowy guilds with unlimited resources, no master craftsmen forging perfect weapons, and certainly no retirement plans. The reality of being a professional murderer in the Middle Ages was a nightmare of incompetent tools, paranoid employers, horrific working conditions, and an almost guaranteed brutal death. This is the story of why being a medieval assassin was, quite possibly, one of the worst career choices in human history. Let's start with the most basic problem. Medieval assassins were working with Stone Age technology in an Iron Age world. While we imagine sleek daggers and silent crossbows, the reality was far more crude. Your average hired killer was armed with whatever he could afford or steal, which usually meant weapons that were poorly made, poorly maintained, and poorly suited for the job. Take the humble dagger, supposedly the assassin's weapon of choice. Medieval metallurgy was inconsistent at best. A blade might look sharp and deadly, but medieval steel was often brittle, prone to snapping at crucial moments. The metal was frequently contaminated with impurities that created weak spots. Imagine being halfway through assassinating a duke when your dagger blade breaks off in his shoulder blade, leaving you holding a useless handle while he screams for his guards. Even if your blade held together, keeping it sharp was a constant challenge. Medieval sharpening stones were coarse and uneven. A truly keen edge was nearly impossible to maintain without access to a skilled weaponsmith, which most assassins certainly didn't have. Many killers went into their assignments with blades that were barely sharper than butter knives. The crossbow, often portrayed as the medieval sniper rifle, was equally problematic. These weapons were heavy, cumbersome, and notoriously unreliable. The strings were made from animal sinew or hemp, which stretched, frayed, and snapped without warning. Loading a crossbow was a lengthy, noisy process that required significant strength. The bolts themselves were expensive and difficult to make straight, meaning accuracy was poor even under the best conditions. But perhaps most importantly, crossbows were loud. The sharp crack of the string releasing could be heard from considerable distance, immediately alerting everyone within earshot that someone was shooting. So much for stealth. Many assassination attempts failed simply because the crossbow's noise brought guards running before the assassin could escape. Then there was the poison problem. Medieval assassins are often depicted using exotic toxins to quietly dispatch their victims, but the reality was far more frustrating. First, acquiring poison was extremely difficult. The most effective toxins came from rare plants or exotic animals that were simply unavailable to most people. What was available locally was often unreliable. Arsenic, one of the few truly effective poisons medieval assassins could obtain, was expensive and hard to conceal in food or drink due to its metallic taste. Deadly nightshade was more accessible, but highly unpredictable in its effects. The potency varied wildly depending on the plant's age, how it was prepared, and even the season it was harvested. An assassin might spend weeks planning a poisoning only to watch his target suffer mild stomach upset instead of death. Even worse, medieval medicine's understanding of poison was so poor that many substances believed to be lethal were actually harmless, while others thought to be safe were deadly. Assassins regularly poisoned themselves while preparing their weapons or testing their concoctions. There are records of would-be killers dying from their own poisoned blades after accidentally cutting themselves while sharpening. The working conditions for medieval assassins were absolutely miserable. Unlike the comfortable safe houses and sophisticated networks portrayed in fiction, real assassins lived in constant fear and squalor. Most operated alone or in very small groups with no support structure whatsoever. Surveillance work meant spending days or weeks observing targets, often in terrible conditions. Assassins would hide in barns full of rats and fleas, crouch in muddy ditches during rainstorms, or squeeze into spaces barely large enough for a human body. Medieval buildings offered few comfortable hiding spots. There was no central heating, no glass windows, and precious little privacy anywhere. The smell alone was overwhelming. Medieval cities and castles reeked of human waste, rotting food, unwashed bodies, and animal dung. Assassins trying to blend in or hide had to endure these conditions for extended periods without bathing or changing clothes, making them increasingly conspicuous as their own odor grew worse. Disease was a constant threat. The bubonic plague swept through Europe repeatedly during the medieval period, but it was far from the only killer. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and countless other diseases ran rampant in the crowded, unsanitary conditions where assassins often had to work and hide. Many assassins died not from violence, but from the diseases they contracted while stalking their targets through filthy medieval cities. Food was another major problem. Assassins couldn't simply walk into taverns and order meals without risking recognition. They had to rely on whatever food they could steal, scavenge, or preserve during long surveillance periods. Much of medieval food was spoiled, contaminated, or nutritionally inadequate. Assassins frequently suffered from malnutrition, food poisoning, and vitamin deficiencies that affected their physical and mental performance. Sleep was nearly impossible under these conditions. Assassins had to remain constantly alert for both their targets and potential threats to themselves. They slept in shifts if working with partners, or caught brief naps while hiding in uncomfortable positions. Chronic sleep deprivation made them prone to mistakes, poor judgment, and slower reflexes at exactly the moments when peak performance was most crucial. The economics of assassination were brutal. Unlike modern hitmen, who might command substantial fees, medieval assassins were typically desperate people working for minimal compensation. The job market was oversaturated with individuals willing to kill for money, which drove prices down to near subsistence levels. Most assassination contracts paid only enough to cover basic survival for a few weeks or months. There were no guarantees of regular work, no benefits, and certainly no retirement savings. An assassin might go months between jobs, struggling to survive on whatever menial labor he could find without attracting attention to his real profession. The upfront costs were significant. Weapons, even poor quality ones, were expensive. A decent dagger might cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a common laborer. Crossbows were luxury items that only the wealthy could afford. Most assassins had to steal their weapons, or buy them second-hand from questionable sources, which meant they were often broken, dull, or unreliable. Travel expenses ate up much of an assassin's potential profit. Medieval transportation was slow, dangerous, and costly. Walking everywhere was free but time-consuming and exhausting. Hiring horses or cart space was expensive and left paper trails that smart assassins wanted to avoid. Many assassination contracts required travel to distant locations, sometimes in other countries, turning what seemed like profitable work into financial disasters. Then there were bribes. Successful assassinations often required paying off guards, servants, or other individuals for information or access. These costs were rarely covered in the original contract, coming straight out of the assassin's fee. A job that initially seemed profitable might end up costing more in bribes than it paid. Medieval assassins had no legal protections whatsoever. They couldn't form guilds or unions to protect their interests. They had no contracts with enforceable in terms. If an employer decided not to pay after the job was completed, the assassin had no recourse except violence, which created additional risks and often led to cycles of revenge that ended badly for everyone involved. Medical care was another major expense that assassins rarely considered until it was too late. Getting wounded was an occupational hazard, but medical treatment was primitive, expensive, and often more dangerous than the original injury. Many assassins died from infected wounds that would be easily treatable today. The legal system was stacked against assassins in every possible way. Murder was universally condemned by both secular and religious law, carrying the death penalty in virtually all medieval jurisdictions. But the justice system was so biased and corrupt that assassins faced additional disadvantages beyond the obvious legal ones. Torture was standard practice in medieval criminal investigations. Suspected assassins could expect to be subjected to horrific torture methods designed to extract confessions and information about accomplices or employers. The rack, thumbscrews, hot irons, and countless other devices were used routinely. Many suspects died during torture, while others were permanently crippled, even if eventually released. The concept of due process barely existed. Accusations were often enough for conviction, especially if the accused was a known criminal or outsider. Assassins rarely had access to legal representation, and the few lawyers available were expensive and often ineffective against determined. Prosecutors' trials were public spectacles designed more for entertainment than justice. Crowds gathered to watch proceedings, often influencing outcomes through their reactions. Popular nobles or clergy members were more likely to receive favorable treatment, while unpopular defendants faced hostile audiences that presumed guilt. Execution methods were deliberately brutal and public. Hanging was considered merciful compared to alternatives like drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, or breaking on the wheel. These executions were public events designed to deter crime through fear, meaning assassins faced not just death, but prolonged public torture before dying. Even if an assassin managed to avoid execution, imprisonment was hardly better. Medieval prisons were hellholes of disease, violence, and starvation. Prisoners were expected to pay for their own food and accommodations. Those without money starved to death or died from exposure. Prison guards were often as dangerous as fellow inmates, demanding bribes and sexual favors from vulnerable prisoners. The social isolation was perhaps one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of the assassin's life. By choosing this profession, individuals cut themselves off from normal human relationships and community connections that were essential for survival and mental health in medieval society. Trust was impossible. Assassins couldn't form genuine friendships because anyone might be a potential threat, employer, or law enforcement informant. Romantic relationships were nearly impossible to maintain when your profession involved regular travel, extended absences, and the constant risk of violent death or imprisonment. Family relationships became strained or impossible. Having an assassin in the family brought shame and danger to everyone related to them. Many assassins were disowned by their families or chose to cut contact to protect their relatives from guilt by association. Religious participation, which was central to medieval social life, became problematic for assassins. The Catholic Church condemned murder as a mortal sin, and assassins who continued practicing their faith lived with constant awareness of their damnation. Those who abandoned religion lost another important source of community and moral guidance. Professional relationships were limited to other criminals, creating a social circle of similarly desperate, violent, and untrustworthy individuals. These relationships were typically temporary and transactional, offering little emotional support or genuine companionship. The constant stress of social isolation led to mental health problems that medieval society had no ability to understand or treat. Depression, anxiety, paranoia, and other psychological disorders were common among assassins, but were interpreted as moral failings or supernatural influences rather than treatable medical conditions. Medieval intelligence gathering was primitive compared to modern standards, leaving assassins working with incomplete or inaccurate information about their targets and missions. There were no photographs, no detailed maps, no reliable communication networks, and no systematic record-keeping that could help assassins plan their attacks. Identifying targets was often problematic. Without photography or detailed descriptions, assassins sometimes had to work from crude drawings or verbal descriptions that might describe dozens of people. Mistakes were common, leading to innocent deaths and failed missions that still carried full legal penalties. Information about target, schedules, habits, and security arrangements was unreliable. Servants and informants might lie, exaggerate, or simply be wrong about important details. An assassin might spend weeks planning an attack based on false information about when and where a target would appear. Communication with employers was sporadic and dangerous. There were no secure communication methods, no encrypted messages, and no reliable postal systems. Instructions were often passed through multiple intermediaries, each adding potential errors or misunderstandings. Written communications were dangerous because they provided evidence of the conspiracy. Security arrangements were often unknown until the actual assassination attempt. Medieval nobles and clergy were increasingly paranoid about assassination. Attempts and employed various security measures that might not be apparent to outside observers. Hidden guards, armored clothing, food tasters, and other precautions could ruin carefully planned attacks. Escape routes had to be planned without detailed knowledge of the terrain. Medieval maps were scarce, inaccurate, and often treated as state secrets. Assassins had to rely on personal reconnaissance or local knowledge from unreliable sources. Many escape attempts failed because the assassin got lost or encountered unexpected obstacles. Weather information was non-existent, making it impossible to plan around conditions that might affect the mission. A rainstorm could flood escape routes, snow could make travel impossible, or fog could provide unexpected cover or dangerous visibility problems. The physical demands of medieval assassination were brutal and unforgiving. Unlike modern criminals who can rely on firearms and vehicles, medieval assassins had to depend entirely on their physical capabilities, which were constantly challenged by the harsh conditions of medieval life. Medieval nutrition was poor even for wealthy individuals, and assassins rarely had access to adequate food. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to scurvy, night blindness, anemia, and other conditions that reduced physical performance. Protein deficiency affected muscle development and healing from injuries. Physical fitness had to be maintained. Without access to proper training facilities or equipment, assassins had to stay strong and agile while living in hiding, often in cramped conditions that prevented regular exercise. The combination of poor nutrition and limited exercise opportunities left many assassins in poor physical condition when they most needed peak performance. Injuries were common and healed poorly. Without proper medical care, even minor cuts and bruises could become infected and life-threatening. Broken bones often healed incorrectly, leaving permanent disabilities. Dental problems were universal and could cause constant pain that affected concentration and performance. Sleep deprivation was chronic due to the irregular schedules and dangerous conditions of the work. Assassins often had to work at night when targets were most vulnerable, then hide during the day when they might be discovered. This reversed schedule was exhausting and affected judgment, reflexes, and emotional stability. Substance abuse was common as assassins tried to cope with pain, fear, and stress. Alcohol was readily available and often safer to drink than water, but chronic alcoholism was common among criminals. Other drugs were less available, but sometimes used to manage pain or boost courage before dangerous missions. Mental health problems were inevitable under these conditions, but completely untreated. The constant stress, social isolation, and moral conflicts of the profession led to anxiety, depression, and other psychological disorders that medieval society couldn't recognize or address. Despite all these challenges, medieval assassins faced the constant threat of violence from multiple sources. Their targets were often well protected and dangerous themselves, but they also had to worry about rival assassins, double-crossing employers, and law enforcement. Target security was increasingly sophisticated as assassination attempts became more common. Wealthy nobles and clergy employed bodyguards, food tasters, and other security measures. Many targets wore concealed armor or carried weapons, making them more dangerous than they appeared. Rival assassins were a constant threat. The profession attracted violent, desperate individuals who wouldn't hesitate to eliminate competition. Assassins sometimes killed each other over contracts, territorial disputes, or personal conflicts. There was no honor among these criminals. Employers often tried to eliminate assassins after jobs were completed to avoid paying fees and prevent the assassins from becoming witnesses or blackmailers. Many assassination contracts were essentially suicide missions where the assassin was never intended to survive. Law enforcement, while primitive, was motivated by substantial rewards for capturing assassins. Bounty hunters, corrupt officials, and opportunistic citizens all posed threats to assassins trying to operate or escape after missions. Criminal associates were unreliable and dangerous. The criminal underworld was filled with individuals who would betray associates for personal gain. Assassins had to constantly watch for betrayal from people they worked with. Random violence was common in medieval society. Assassins, often carrying weapons and valuables, were attractive targets for common criminals. Street robberies, tavern fights, and other random violence posed additional risks to individuals already living dangerous lives. Personal enemies multiplied over time. Every assassination created potential enemies among the victim's family, friends, and associates. Assassins accumulated enemies throughout their careers, creating ever-increasing risks of revenge attacks. The psychological toll of medieval assassination was devastating and permanent. The combination of social isolation, constant danger, moral conflicts, and brutal working conditions destroyed the mental health of most practitioners. Guilt and moral conflict were constant companions. Even the most hardened killers struggled with the reality of taking human lives for money. Medieval society was deeply religious, and most assassins had been raised with strong moral teachings against murder. The conflict between survival necessity and moral beliefs created constant internal torment. Paranoia was a survival necessity that became pathological. Assassins had to assume everyone was a potential threat. Every conversation might be a trap, and every relationship could be a betrayal. This hypervigilance was essential for survival, but made normal human relationships impossible. Fear was constant and exhausting. Assassins lived with the knowledge that they could be discovered, betrayed, or killed at any moment. This chronic stress led to anxiety disorders, sleep problems, and other psychological symptoms that were misunderstood and untreated in medieval times. Nightmares and intrusive thoughts were common among individuals who had witnessed and participated in extreme violence. Medieval assassins had no way to process or treat what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Substance abuse became a coping mechanism for many assassins trying to manage psychological pain. Alcohol was the most common escape, but other substances were sometimes available. Addiction created additional problems and made assassins more vulnerable to capture or death. Suicidal thoughts were common among individuals trapped in this lifestyle. With no apparent way out, many assassins died in what appeared to be reckless missions but were actually suicide attempts. The combination of despair, guilt, and hopelessness made death seem preferable to continued existence. The few medieval assassins who managed to survive long enough to retire faced their own unique set of problems. There was no such thing as a comfortable retirement for individuals who had spent their careers making enemies, violating laws, and alienating themselves from normal society. Age brought physical decline that made continued work impossible. But there were no alternative career options for aging assassins. Medieval society offered no retraining programs or career counseling for former criminals. Most aging assassins faced poverty, homelessness, and abandonment. Medical problems accumulated without proper treatment. Years of poor nutrition, physical trauma, and stress led to chronic health conditions that were expensive and difficult to treat. Aging assassins often died painful deaths from untreated injuries and diseases. Legal immunity didn't exist for retired assassins. Past crimes could be prosecuted at any time, and enemies didn't forget or forgive just because the assassin stopped working. Many retired assassins were eventually captured and executed for crimes committed years or decades earlier. Social reintegration was nearly impossible. Former assassins couldn't form normal relationships or participate in community activities because their past made them permanent outcasts. They remained isolated and suspicious even after abandoning their criminal careers. Financial security was impossible to achieve. Assassins rarely accumulated enough wealth to support themselves in retirement, and they couldn't invest in legitimate businesses or property without revealing their criminal backgrounds. Most faced poverty in their final years. Family relationships remained damaged or non-existent. Children and spouses who had been abandoned or endangered by the assassin's career rarely welcomed them back. Many retired assassins died alone, having destroyed all their personal relationships during their working years. Religious redemption was complicated by the Catholic Church's teachings about mortal sin and the need for confession and penance. Former assassins who sought religious comfort faced the requirement to confess their crimes publicly, which often led to legal prosecution and execution. Mental health problems persisted and often worsened in retirement. Without the adrenaline and purpose of active work, many retired assassins fell into severe depression. The guilt and trauma of their past actions became more prominent when they had time to think about what they had done. Death rarely came peacefully for medieval assassins. Even those who managed to retire typically died violent deaths from enemies seeking revenge, legal authorities finally catching up with them, or the cumulative effects of their brutal lifestyle. The medieval period produced very few reliable historical records about assassins, largely because those who kept records were the same authorities who were trying to capture and execute these criminals. Most of what we know comes from court records of trials and executions, which naturally focus on the failures rather than any successes. Archaeological evidence suggests that medieval assassination was far more common than historical records indicate, but also far less successful than popular culture suggests. Skeletal remains show evidence of failed assassination attempts, botched murders, and the brutal executions that awaited captured assassins. The few contemporary accounts that exist describe medieval assassins as desperate, pathetic figures rather than the skilled professionals of popular imagination. They were typically portrayed as beggars, madmen, or tools of more powerful individuals rather than independent operators with their own agendas. Legal documents reveal the primitive investigative techniques used to catch assassins, but also show how often the wrong people were tortured and executed for these crimes. The medieval justice system was more concerned with punishing someone for high-profile murders than with ensuring they punished the right person. Religious writings from the period condemn assassination while acknowledging its prevalence, suggesting that medieval society was deeply troubled by the frequency of political murders, but had no effective methods for preventing them. The economic records that survive indicate that professional assassination was rarely profitable enough to support a full-time career. Most medieval killers for hire were part-time criminals who combined occasional murders with other illegal activities like theft, smuggling, or extortion. Medical records from the period, limited as they are, show the horrific injuries and diseases that were common among violent criminals. Medieval assassins suffered from malnutrition, infections, parasites, and trauma injuries that would be easily treatable today, but were often fatal in medieval times. Travel records and customs documents suggest that medieval assassins were often caught because they were unfamiliar with local customs, languages, or geography. International assassination attempts were particularly difficult because foreigners were automatically suspicious in most medieval communities. The reality of medieval assassination stands in stark contrast to our romanticized modern portrayals. These were not skilled professionals operating with honor and efficiency. They were desperate, poorly equipped individuals working under horrific conditions for minimal pay, facing almost certain death or capture. The combination of primitive technology, brutal working conditions, inadequate compensation, legal persecution, social isolation, and psychological trauma made medieval assassination one of the most miserable professions imaginable. The few individuals who chose this path typically did so out of desperation rather than ambition, and almost none survived long enough to enjoy any benefits their criminal careers might have provided. Medieval assassins lived short, brutal lives, filled with fear, pain, and moral conflict. They were hunted by authorities, betrayed by associates, abandoned by families, and condemned by their own consciences. Even those rare individuals who managed to survive their criminal careers faced poverty, isolation, and violent death in their final years. The next time you see a movie or read a book about medieval assassins living glamorous lives of adventure and intrigue, remember the real story. These were not romantic anti-heroes or skilled professionals. They were desperate people who chose one of the worst possible ways to make a living in an already brutal time period. The medieval assassin's life was so universally miserable that it serves as a perfect example of how popular culture can completely distort historical reality. The real medieval world was harsh enough for ordinary people trying to live honest lives. For those who chose to become professional killers, it was quite literally a living hell that almost always ended in a violent, painful death. In every measurable way, being a medieval assassin was a terrible career choice that brought nothing but suffering to those unfortunate enough to pursue it. The technology was inadequate, the working conditions were horrific, the pay was minimal, the legal penalties were brutal, and the psychological costs were devastating. It represents perhaps the ultimate example of why crime, particularly violent crime, has never been a viable path to success or happiness in any historical period. The lesson from medieval assassins is clear. Despite what popular entertainment might suggest, there has never been a golden age for professional killers. The reality has always been ugly, brutal, and ultimately self-destructive for those who choose that path.